All right, welcome back. We are COMP397 in the winter 2020 semester. That's web game programming at Centennial, and we're week 5, part 1 of our broadcast. We're going to be talking about finite state machines today. But first, let's talk about our project. So today you have a project part that was due. That's and if we look at our schedule, right? So on our schedule, I always go back to this project document. And remember where we are. We're sitting at week 5, right? And your first playable build is due today. Okay, that's your first playable build. However, one thing I've noted is some of you have had a lot of busy stuff happening. So I'm moving the due date to tomorrow, right, to give you an extra day. So if you look at the due dates up on eCentennial, and if I go to assignments, on the bottom you can see that there is a project part 3, and project part 3, the release date, the date is going to be tomorrow. That's due February 9th, tomorrow night at midnight. Okay, so that's when it's going to be due. So there's a couple reasons for this. One of them is I really haven't talked about some of the stuff I want you to know about, and also I wanted to give you an extra day just to kind of get together and do what you have to do. I know you have a lot of stuff going on right now. Okay, so the due date for this one is tomorrow. That's Sunday, February the 9th at midnight. Okay, it gives you an extra day. Okay, so that's that. Also, just wanted to remind you that next week, your assignment 1 is due next week. So remember I gave you an assignment for your slot machine? And here it is, a simple slot machine. That's due week 6. So this week is week 5. This one's due week 6. What I may do with the slot machine is also move it to the Sunday to give you an extra day. Okay, just letting you know. Remember, this is an individual assignment. It's for everybody to do, and the slot machine will prepare you for your midterm exam, which happens on the Saturday, the last Saturday before the break, which is week 7. So the Saturday after next week. Okay, just letting you know. So if you don't do your own slot machine, or if you work with somebody else and you don't understand the code, then the midterm test will be very difficult because you need to know what you're doing, right? All I'm evaluating on the midterm test is going to be, do you understand Create.js? Do you understand TypeScript? Do you understand how to do buttons and labels? If all those answers are yes, by the time we get to there, then you should be fine. If you don't understand some of those things, then you need to practice in order for you to get there and understand. Okay? So that is what's due. But today we're talking about finite state machine. The first thing I'd like to do is look at our previous week's project. So I'm going to bring up our folders for last week. We were using actually something 3C. I'm just going to copy from 3C and paste it. And I'm going to make 5D. We just kept going with 3C last week. But this week we're going to change this to 5C. I don't know where D came from. 5C. There we go. Okay. I did 5B with the previous class today, but you guys are 5C. All right, so cool. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code now. Here's VS Code. Let's just close down the previous code. Previous window, and let's just open this up one more time. I meant to close the folder. I'll be okay. And let's pass in 5C. All right, so just like we've done in the past, whenever we look at our folder, what I want to do is in my package.json, I want to change this from 3C to 5C and less than 5. This is kind of just for completeness. I don't really need to do this. In my index.html, it should say less than 5, not less than 3. Just so that we're up to date with everything. So now that we've made those changes, the next step we should do whenever we get our code is we should put this up on GitHub. So again, I'm going to clear the screen. But right now, my local project points to the repository from last week. And I need a new repository for this week. 5C. I don't have that. Let's make it up on GitHub. So I'm going to go to GitHub. And on GitHub, I'll make a brand new repository by clicking the new button. So again, it's COMP397 in the winter 2020 semester, and it's lesson 5C. What this is going to do is it's going to give me some steering instructions on how to put together our Git repository. We've done all of this, but I need to change my remote. Remember, my remote is actually a link to GitHub. That's all it is. We're not connected to GitHub all the time. Only when I need to push or pull. That's the only time I'm connected. Okay, what this means is I need to change my remote, and I can do a command like git remote remove origin. The remote, the link between your local files and GitHub, has a name. In this case, it's named origin. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to remove it. And then I'm just going to take this stuff, so I'm going to copy these two lines, and then come here and right click, and then press enter. And now it's going to take all the files from last week and push them into the new repository, and I'm going to keep my commits, which is important. I'm not going to lose my commits. So now I have two repositories, one from last week, one from this week. This week's repository, we're going to start fresh with 5C. All right. That's cool. Now the next thing to do is, first of all, let's see if it's here. So if I refresh, you can see that my repository is here. I have 4 commits. These are all from last week. So I added my initial commit, my vector2 class, which we worked hard on, my game object, my player. This week we're talking about finite state machines, and we're gonna fix up our little collision manager class. We're gonna do that today. Okay. Again, like I said earlier, your first playable release is going to be due tomorrow, not today. I've moved it off one day to give you extra time. Okay, so cool. So we have this, and I want to kind of see what we have. So Control-Shift-B, it's going to build. I'm going to go into my watch task, right? And it's going to, so I want to transpile between TypeScript and JavaScript. That's what that Control-Shift-B does. And then what I want to do is I want to run light server so I can see what my web page looks like right now. And it looks like this. So if I move my stuff around, I see my little placeholder, and you can see it's on the top left here. It's not centered. And if I look at inspect, and if I go to inspect on the console, what I'm hoping to see is when I pass over my button, then now you can see that there's going to be a collision, but there's a bit of an issue here, right? It's not colliding properly. Take a look. It's colliding on this side, maybe on this side a lot, but this side, not great collisions. This side, not so good. This side up here, not so good, right? So it only collides a little bit. We have to fix that up, and I'll talk about how this works. All right, so this is our example. All right, so let's take a look and see what we've got so far. So far, if I scroll down, I have my start. My start initializes stuff in my create.js. I'm using create.js. And then I have this stuff, top left player, top left button. And I've got some very specific code, and here's my AABB collision code. I got some very specific code for how this works. So where I have my player position X and player position Y and all this kind of stuff, right? And here I use 2 different kinds of collision detection methodology. One is AABB collision, which is axis aligned bounding box. We covered that last week. And also some kind of collision detection that does squared distance or squared radius. That's what it is. It compares, the radii. As an example, it compares the radii to the distance in position between the player and the start button. But these checks, these collision manager checks, are very specific. It's only ever going to work this way for 2 things, the player and the button. And this makes no sense for us. We should make it so that it can work, my collision detection can work for any object to a degree. So we need to fix this up. Also, if I want my placeholder to be centered, right now it's not centered, it's in the top left corner of the screen. How do I fix that problem? So in my objects, right, I have my player object. Here's my player.ts. And by default, if I look, right, it gets input from stage X and stage mouse X and mouse Y. It calls the super constructor. The super constructor basically sets up, calls my game object and sets X and Y coordinates, and if it's centered or not. So if I go to my super duper game object superclass, we can see that the game object superclass in here says that centered is false by default. Okay, that's what the game object superclass does. And then what the game object superclass is going to do is, when I'm finished loading, it's going to set my position. That's what's going to happen. Okay, so that's what it's doing. Pretty straightforward. But it's not centered, because in my game.ts, when I instantiated my player, right? So again, this is the update function, but in my main, which is way down here, I instantiated my player as just a player. So it took on the default values. If I wanted my player to be centered, right, then I'd have to go in here and center the player. So I have to say something like, well, my player, you know, as an example, you can see that this is my player object. And I don't have an option. I can't go in here and say I want it centered or not. My player is literally a default object right now. So it doesn't really do much. In my player.ts, and that's because it calls the super constructor, and I just pass in a basic image. That's what my player object does. So that's why it's not centered, because I don't make it centered, and that's fine. So what if I wanted to make it centered? What can I make some kind of getter or setter to set the registration marks to my player for it to be centered? Because I want my player to have the ability to be centered. So my game object itself, right now, it just checks to see if it's centered, and it only does this once on the constructor function. It calculates the new registration values here. Okay? So is there a way that I can set my centered, right? One other thing it does this track to see if I'm centered or not? The answer is it doesn't. It doesn't have the capability of even tracking if I am centered or not. So let's give it that capability, my game object superclass. So again, I'm going to go here, private. I'm just working in my player right now. Private is centered. It's going to be a Boolean if it's centered or not. I've got to set it up. So if it's centered, it's going to, just like I initialize stuff here, I'm going to say by default that this is underscore is centered is equal to false, just to set up that part. So it's not centered by default. However, if this flag changes, this centered from false and it changed to true, I want to set is centered to true. So depending on what this is, if it's centered, I want to do this, but I want to set is centered to true. Now, I know that somewhere down the line, I want to be able to center my object from outside. That's what I want to do. I want to be able to center my object from outside. Okay? So that means like I want to say is centered true. And then if it's centered true, it just takes my object, measures it, and then centers my object. So the anchor point becomes center. That's what has happened. Because right now, when I look at my object, right, my anchor point is not centered. It's the top left corner of my object. See? Right where my mouse points, top left corner. And I don't want that. I want to be able to switch it around if I want. So we need a getter and setter for this. Okay, so here we're going to set up getters and setters for is centered. So I'm going to say get is centered. And it's going to return a Boolean. Right? I'm going to return this underscore is centered. Okay, that's the getter. And for the setter, we're going to do the same thing, but some slight differences. If is centered, and we'll say new state, Boolean. Then I'm going to say that this dot underscore is centered is true, or is equal to new state, sorry, whatever the new state is. And then I'm going to check. And I made a Boolean. That's good. That's a new type, Boolean. Okay, of course it's not. I want to check to see if this is true. If it is centered, if it's true, then I want to do my registration changes. Okay? So what I mean is, I want to say that I want to center my object somehow. Okay? I don't have such a method to do that right now, but I'm going to create a private method to help me do this. So down in private methods, I have compute width and compute height, and I have a check bounds method which is void. Right now it's a protected method, but I also want to be able to center stuff. I'm going to say a private method called center, right? And this center object, I'm going to say center game object. Let's say we'll call it center game object. It's going to be internal, right? So it's not going to return anything. It's only going to be it's like the internal guts of the machine. You don't see this outside of the class. This is anything with an underscore means is private, right? And the centering is going to do exactly what I said. It's going to do this. This. But I also want to do this. Again, I want to measure anyway. Okay? However, I can't do this until the object is loaded. So for now, let's just do this part and see what happens. We know what this half height and half width is. Okay, that's what that is. And we'll put that in here. Okay. So center game object, right? Okay. Well, can we do this, first of all, here? So instead of typing this again, we just say this dot underscore center game object, right? So that's kind of what we're doing. We're just making this happen, right? But I also want to center the game object if it's centered. If centered is true. So if, right? And I can use the new state. If new state is true, that's what this means, then, well, I want to call this or this new function I made, which is center game object, right? I don't want to type this again. And do I have to do it this way? No, but I think it's more descriptive when you look at this and you're like, hey, what is he doing? Oh, he's centering it now because it is centered. I can set that it's centered or not, and when I do, it literally centers the game object. Okay, does this change anything right now? Right? Does this change anything? Because one thing we have to do is we have to also track that it's centered. Here, we're not tracking anything. So if it's centered, we're calling this. But if I just do this, right, this part, then we're also good. And we also keep track of state. We know what state it is. So instead of doing this, we'll just do this dot is centered is equal to centered. Because centered is true, right? I could also just say true. And if I did this, then I don't need the if statement. Whatever the if statement is, right, is what it's going to be set to. I don't have to have this if. I can save myself these lines. I can just do this. Because this is equivalent, right? Because I'm going to do whatever, if it's false or true, it's going to be whatever that is. I don't have to make an if statement. And my friends, if statements are more computationally expensive than assignment statements. They're still very close. They're not that much. But if statement is a branch. It says if this, then do that, right? So I'd rather do assignments if I can. Okay, let's see if this just works as is. I'm not doing anything different right now. So I'm going to save this, and if everything goes well, then when we start the game, it should be still the same, right? Except I have I have a few more pieces of information, right, than I had before. A few pieces of information. And one piece is, hey, I can check to see if my object is centered or not. I need to know this later on for collision detection. Okay, cool, excellent. But can I set it to be centered outside of my class? That's a different thing. Will it work? Okay, so let's go back to my class, which is my game.ts. And here where I set up a new object here, I just want to say before I enter it in, I'm going to say player.isCentered, right, is true. I should be able to do that now. And what it should do is the regex value of this thing is going to be the half width and half height, right, of my object. So now if I save it, we should see, if we did it right, that my object is centered, but it's not. Why is that? So now we have to do some debugging. And the reason why I want to do debugging is because it's not working. So first we do some refreshing. We make sure everything's refreshed. Want to make sure everything's transpiled. This is good. So this should work, right? I mean, I'm centering it, so why isn't it working? Well, we kind of added it to the stage after it was centered. Okay, that's okay. We're saying it's true. That's okay. So let's track it and see what we're getting. So see if this true goes in where it's supposed to go. Because we've already done it once. We know it works because it doesn't center, right? So far. It went through this. And to check this, if I go back to my player.ts, here's my player. Let's go back to game object. Here's my game object. Do we get here? Do we get to this is centered? So that means this is centered, which is this right here, right? Do we come to this new state? So let's do a console log. We can do a console log, or we can just simply use a breakpoint. And a breakpoint we'll put in the gutter, right? And again, if I click on this little bug icon on the Visual Studio Code, it's going to, remember we set this up last week. If I go to home, what it does is in the VS Code folder, it sets up a configuration for debugging. That's what it does. So when I click on the bug now, all I have to do is click this little start button, and then what it's going to do is launch a little browser, and it's going to take me to my breakpoint. I get information. I get information about everything. Okay, so I come here for the first time, and it says new state is true. This is the first time I've come here to this new state. New state is true. Okay, so then is centered is true. We save that. And then I come to this. So let's step into that. I come to this. So far my regex is 0. And then my half width is 0. Let's go to the next line. You can see still my half width is 0. So how is it that my player counts my width as 0? Half width. Oh man. What is half width? I'm going to ask myself. Go to definition. Half width. Well, when I get half width, I do the following. I calculate, I just take whatever it is and I get half the width, which is take the width. And when I set width, I set half the width. It computes my half width. That's what it does when I set the width. When I set width, but not when I get width. So do I ever come to these places where I set the width and the height? Because this is important. Remember, all game objects, every game object will go through this process, right? Other things I want to know is, it's hard for me when I do debugging, which object I'm talking about, because I'm going to have two objects on the screen that are going to go through this process. I have my button, actually three. Well, two. I have my button and I have my player. Both are game objects. So which one is this? That's a problem. So let's set up additional information on my player. So inside of my player object, this is for debugging purposes only. I can turn this off later. in my start method, I'm going to set the name. Every object in CreateJS has a name property. I can set the name to something. So I can say this dot name is equal to player. Okay. And for my button, which is this button right here, I can do the same thing. I can say on start, this dot name is equal to button. I don't know what kind of button it is. It's a button. Okay? Does that make sense? So I can differentiate between button and my player object. I don't know which one it is right now. Okay, let's go through that debugging again. So if I go back to my bug hunt as an example, and I go back to see what that looks like. If I press play, I still probably have a point right here. And now I can start inspecting. So local, this is the player, right? And this is really great because what I can do is I can drag these this stuff around until I find the name. So I see name is player. So that's what I'm inspecting, the player. Okay? I'm saying the player is centered. The player is centered. That's the first time I'm using this thing. Is centered, right? I'm passing it in. Here's the new state is true. And then I'm coming to this point. I'm stepping into, right? But let's take a look at some of the other things. Regx and regY are 0. So I can see all the variables here. Rotation is 0, scale is 1. And I keep going here to other things. These are all my variables. All of them. Right now my height is 0. My half height is 0. Half width is 0. Everything is 0, right? Here's my image right now. Here's my image. Notice that my image is, well, kind of nothing, right? There is no image yet. So this is like, I'm getting this called is centered, right? As an example. This is where I'm stopping, right here, is centered, right? And it's happening the first time. It's happening when I'm checking if is centered is true. The first time around. Okay? So this is not happening when I'm checking it outside. I'm checking it inside. What I mean by that is I have my constructor, which is right here. And then I basically come to this point, and because this is true, then I set this to true. But what is width and height? This is 0 and this is 0. And how about this? So width and height. It shows that my width and height is 0. What? How is that possible? How is my width and height 0? Right? My width and height can't be 0. I'm loading an object. This object right here, which is placeholder. And placeholder is definitely not 0. Okay, let's continue. Let's see if I come back here again. So, okay, I come back here. I've come back second time now, all right? All right, now I have values. Look, I have half height and half width and height. This happens when everything reloads. This happens when I'm listening for an event handler. That's what's happening. And when my object loads, I do this again, second time. All right, so now I have some values. Half height and half width is 75. Height is 50. Okay, cool. So new state is this. Let's jump into this one. So I'm going to go into that state. And I know that this is 75 and this is 25. That's when this happens. So this is the second time I'm doing this now, right? And then my regx and reg value right now is 0, but I'm going to step over this one. And now my regx is 75. Whatever the half height was, so too is regx, 75. Half width, half height, 75. Okay, cool. Okay, does that make sense? Let's keep going. So I'm going to continue to step over the next one. So step over, step over. I'm back to here, and now, okay, so it went by it. I'm over here right now, and I'm just going to press continue. Okay, cool. Cool. Still okay. But what happened? What happened? I don't understand. I mean, it was supposed to do what it was supposed to do, regex and reg-y. My registration points were supposed to be half width and half height. Did I get half width and half height? No. No. I got full width and full height, my friends. Look. Full width and full height. Width and height are here, right? And what's happening is I want half width and half height. So if I go to width now, let's go to width, go to definition. Here's width. Then half width is set by computing this width. So let's see if I ever do compute width. Go to definition, which is this little function here. It takes half width and half height and computes these things. Let's put a breakpoint here as well. Half width. So when I compute my half width, do I ever do this? And let's stop it and rerun it. So I'll rerun the breakpoint. Okay, cool. So I'm here centering my game object. I'm going to continue. And then I come to this point here. And we can see now that my width is 150. And I'm going to calculate my half width as 75. So 75 is the right width, right? Why is it not being centered? Why is my regex value not being used? Again, why? Because we need to know why. Because this is the problem. This is the problem that's happening. We're trying to set it, and the breakpoints are there, but it's not. So we've tried this. It looks like it's okay, right? It's looking like it's working. So it looks like it should work the way it should work, the way we have it. But then when we come to this point here, center game object, right? Does it do what it's supposed to do? Is this regex and reg-y value valid? So let's just go to the next thing. You can see that's going to stop here. I'm just going to remove this breakpoint, stop it. And I want to center my game object. Let's see if this works. I'm going to stop it here again. So when it comes to this point, I'm going to see what half width and half height is. So here's half width. Let's try that one more time. So and there we go. So what is half width? How's that possible? It's coming to center game object, right? But somehow I'm reading half width as 0. Why? Why is this 0? Can anyone help me? You guys are going to have these debugging problems, and then you're not going to know how to deal with them. So I need your help here so we can understand together. Because we got lots of more stuff to cover today. And this is part of what we're doing. Okay, so how is it that I can't center my object? Why is that? I can't do it here. Look, half width and half height. I can't do it. Even though I say regex and reg-y values, but I just can't seem to center it. It becomes 0. Right? Half width and half height is 0. And when I get half width and half height, it's like it's not storing it somehow. Because I'm here, I said, okay, here when I do this calculation the first time, it's 0. So now let's run it again. Cool, I come back to this point. Now half width is 75. That means regex is 75. So when I come back the second time, because now the image first wasn't loaded and now it is loaded, right? And so when I calculate center my game object, which it works, then we know that what half width and half height is. And you can see that those values are right here. I have the values. Okay, I'm running it again. Cool. And it never comes back. It never comes back. Right? We're running around and it doesn't come back. It only comes there once. Why? Because, my friends, it's asynchronous. That's why. So when I try and do it this way, and this is where we run into some problems of understanding, right? So let me explain why this problem. And you might have this problem, and it's difficult to debug this problem, but we'll talk about it. What I'm asking this to do, right, is, hey, player, load the player, right? Load it. And then I'm asking this to say centered is true. This is correct. But the problem is, even on line 99, even when this is resolved, here, 98, it doesn't stop. It continues reading these lines. That's what it does. It continues reading them, right? So at the beginning, when I load the player is not a thing. I don't see it anymore yet, right? I'm loading the player, but the player hasn't finished loading yet. This right here, at this point, for example, if I want to see what the player looks like here, if I put a breakpoint here, that's a different breakpoint than inside. I want to know what the player state is. The player should have an object, should have some kind of image that I'm looking at this point, right? Let's see if the player image is loaded. So if I run it again, and I come to that point, and then if I look at this, well, first it says, well, this is undefined. What's the player? The player says, okay, is centered is false by default, is colliding is false, all right? Let's keep going. What about the name? Look, half width and half height are 0, guys. 0, 0, 0, 0, right? That's not true. This isn't true about the player. The player has 75 and 25. But at this moment in time, right now, it is true. That's why this centering doesn't work and never will. Remember that my main function only happens once. It only gets called one time. My update function, well, that happens lots of times. But my main function always happens once. So if I want to make sure that I measure properly, the is centered is true, I got to do the same. I've got to wait till everything is finished loading. That's what I got to wait. I got to wait till it's finished loading before I can do is centered is true. So I got to do like this loading thing like outside of my player object even, which makes no sense. And we're going to solve this next week with a preloader. Okay, we can't do a preloading this week, but because we have no time. But here's how it looks. I can say player dot add event listener. Sorry, player dot image dot add event listener load, right? On load, then do this. Do some kind of function. When the image is finished loading, well then and only then do I want to make sure that it's centered or not. Let's see if this works now. So I'm waiting for the image to load and then I'm centering. Okay, and I'll keep the breakpoint up here too. I'll keep the breakpoint, so it'll come to this point. It only will come here if the image is finished loading. That's the only time it's going to come here. Let's try it. Okay, now it's finished loading, right? Well, actually, let's try that again. Let's continue. Yeah, see, it finished loading now. Now let's take a look. What is my player object? My player has sizes. My player has sizes now. And if I run it now, and if I go back to my screen, now it's centered. See? That's why it's not centering, because the asynchronous nature of JavaScript, which can cause you guys issues when it comes to debugging, right? And that wasn't something I was intending to cover today, but here's an example of how this works. So we have this idea of something being centered and something not being centered. Okay. Yes? We do, but the problem is that this, if I put this inside of my game, when I call the constructor is calling this event listener, right? Inside the constructor. So it's a copy of this thing, right? So if I go back to the constructor for my game object superclass, yes, this is running, right? This constructor right here, see this right here? It's running. But even though the constructor calls this stuff, it's not finished loading for a while. Sometimes it takes a few milliseconds. But that's slow enough, that delay of load is slow enough. So what happens is, for the first time that I run this thing, this creates almost like another, it listens for the event on the event queue. I have one event queue, right? An event queue is a series of things. So I'm listening for this event to trigger. Until this event triggers, until this happens, I'm not going to check to see if it's centered. By default, this thing is not centered. So I don't measure anything until this is done. So this is going to trigger multiple times, this part right here. Even though it's in the constructor, it doesn't matter. It's going to trigger multiple times. And every time I put an event listener like this in, it's going to continue to trigger. If I reload this image, it's going to trigger again.
So also can that is removed from inside this method?
I could, but then if I did this, then my width and height would never be measured. Because it would be never come back here. The only time I measure my width and height is right here, right? And we need to fix this problem. We need to preload all of our assets so that before we call any object, they're already preloaded. We're getting some object that's already preloaded. We're reusing that object, and that's another thing. We can maybe use Ajax to do that when we're loading stuff in. Sometimes we just need to add an event listener to wait for everything to finish loading before we access that image. We create a list of images. Instead of how I'm doing it here directly, which is going here and loading it directly, I have another step that loads all the images inside of a string, instead of an array. And there's references to all the images, right? Then when I have references to all those images, I'm going to make that array when it's finished loading. When I'm finished loading, then I'm going to call the start function. I'm not going to call the start function right away like I'm doing now. First, I'm going to load all the images. Then I'm going to call the start function. And when I go to the start function, everything is loaded already. So I'm not going to have this problem. Okay? But for now, there's no preloader. We're just running as is. Okay, so let's fix the other problem. The main reason why we're together today is I want to take care of collision detection, fix that problem, and I want to talk about state machine, those two things. Collision detection and state machine. We did some collision detection last week, but right now my collision detection is sitting in the open over here, and it's very specific. My collision detection algorithm only works for two objects, player and button, and it only works inside the update method. This is no good. We have to make something so if I have multiple scenes, what if I have 5 scenes, 10 scenes, 100 scenes? And it's not just the player I want to check, it's something else. This is very specific. Do I have to rewrite all this code over and over again? I mean, I could make a function, right? But it's better if I make something that's more of a manager. So I'm going to go into my files here, and I'm going to create a new folder under my scripts folder, a new folder. I'm going to call this folder managers, like this. Here's my managers folder. In my managers folder, I'm going to put a new manager. It's going to be called collision.ts. Okay? Collision.ts. So a collision manager. That's what it's going to be. I'm going to make a new module called managers. Inside my module managers, I'm going to have a new class called collision. And it's not going to inherit from any other class. It's just going to be a class of its own. Okay, inside the class, I'm going to have public static, a new public static function. And that public static function is going to be the same as this one. This one. Okay, so I'm going to have two functions. One, which is going to be AABB, Axis Aligned Bounding Box, collision detection. And the other function we're going to have is squared radius check. Those two functions. Let's list those functions now. So here's the first one. So public static, and I'm going to call this squared radius check. Squared radius check. Okay, squared radius check. I'm going to take two objects. Object 1, which is of type objects dot game object, and object 2, which is also going to be of type objects dot game object. Okay, so that's the square radius check. And then I'm going to do something else. I'm going to do an AABB check. Right? So this is like I'm checking between two axis aligned bounding boxes. That's what I'm doing. AABB actually is what it is. And I need two objects, object 1 and object 2. That's what I want to do. I want to make them public static. Remember, static means that I do not have to instantiate an object of type collision in order for me to use these classes. And in fact, this collision class is really just a container class for these static functions. Like their always in the global space, but I'm separating them with managers collision, almost like organizing my code into little namespaces. Okay, cool. I have to fill in the blanks now with these things, and we have that. In my game.ts, I have an example of me checking for collision here, right? So this is the squared radius check. And I also have things like player half height and so on, player position, start button position. All this stuff is really good stuff, but I want to take all of this, cut it, and put it inside of my collision manager. And it's going to be inside my squared radius check. So let's try this out. So here it is.
Should this method return Boolean?
Yep. We could return Boolean. Right? And this would be good, because then what I can do is I can return some value. It's a good idea. So the player doesn't exist anymore. It's not player half height and start button half height. It's object 1. Object 1 half height. Right? And oops. Yeah. And object 2 half height. That's what that is. That's the radii. All right. Player position and start button position. Well, that's just object 1 dot position. Oops. Object 1 dot position and object 2 dot position. Okay, so I'm checking to see if the squared distance between object 1 and object 2 is less than the radii squared. And if this is true, then potentially I have a collision, but only if object 2 is not colliding. If object 2 is not colliding, then now object 2 is colliding. Okay? And now we can return true. This is our first return. Okay? Cool. However, if it bubbles down into here, we're going to return false. That takes care of this part. Okay, what about this part? Start button, that's object 2. So now it's a generic function, right? It's not, well, I say generic. It means it's a function that can take any two game objects. Game object 1, game object 2. That's how it's going to work. Okay. Furthermore, we can do something similar like this in AABB Check. Yeah.
Why do we are changing the value of this collide inside this method? This method is static, right? I'm not saying it's just to check if the two objects are colliding or not.
Right.
Why do I need to change it?
We're changing state actually, because I'm saying this. Imagine if I have these two objects, right? So I have object 1 and I have object 2, and then I'm passing through this one object is passing through the other one. For every frame, that means every 16 milliseconds, then this statement is true. It's colliding. So it means it's true, it's true, it's true, it's true, it's true, it's true. It's going to keep saying it's true. I don't want that. You should only say it's true once. So I come through it, it goes, okay, colliding.
Okay.
Not colliding. Colliding. Not colliding. That's how it should be, right? Otherwise, if I had a sound clip associated with this, like, I don't know, a yay sound, yay, every time I collide, it'd be like, yeah, 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 because I'm colliding every single second, every single millisecond.
The attribute is changed in the object.
The object too.
Parameter.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. Not this, but the object that I'm hitting.
Okay.
Every object is colliding, yes or no. And I only care if the second object is colliding, not if I'm colliding.
Okay.
I can collide with multiple objects, my player, but the other object can only collide with me once.
Great.
Okay, that's how it works. All right, so I want to do the same thing with AABB Check now. So I'm going to go back to game.ts, and I have my code for AABB, but this top player and stuff, I need to copy all of this. So first, let me just uncomment this out. So again, I can go edit, and then I can toggle my block comment so that it's back. And I can grab all of this code, because I need all of this code, and I got to cut it. And now I'm going to go back to my collision manager and paste it. But we're going to have problems, big problems. And I'm going to talk about those problems right now. And you're going to see why I did the things I did earlier now. Okay, top left player, top left button. That makes no sense anymore. These things should be object 1, top left, object 2, top left. So let's rename those. Rename. object 1 top left, right? And this should be object 2 top left, because we're going to be more generic again, right? Object 2 top left. Yay, okay, now player is object 1, and actually I can do a find replace here. So find, it's going to say, again, you don't want to find everywhere, just in this selection. That's what we're doing. So in this selection only. So find in selection. And I want to find player in this selection, and I'm going to replace it with object 1. Okay? And replace. And I'm going to find in the same selection, right, start button, and replace with object 2, because that's just easier to do. And that takes away these errors. But we may still have an issue. Can any of you see what the issue might be? So top left is my position.x and object1.y. But that's not true all the time. That's true if I'm not centered. What if I'm centered? This is not true then. Because if I'm centered, let me just draw a little diagram for you guys here, right? So right now, right, I want to do collision detection. Oops. I want to do collision detection between two objects. I have object 1 and let's say I have object 2, and they're trying to collide. So the way collision detection works with AABB type collision detection, it works like this. It says, okay, take the top left corner and the bottom right corner, and if this other object is between the top left corner and the bottom right corner, there's a collision. But guess what? The top left corner is the X and Y position. But that's this if it's centered. That means I have to, if I want to get the top left corner, I have to march back from its position, right, half its width, and I have to march up from its position, half its height, because there's an offset to calculate if it's centered. Make sense? So that, if I didn't do that, that means I would start my collision detection here like this. So this object here would be calculating collision detection down here. That's not good. That's where it would start, right here. And it would ignore this part right here, would be ignored. I wouldn't care about that part. I wouldn't collide there. Why? Because it's centered. It starts there. That's where it starts counting. That's the x-axis. Look, it says take a look at the x-axis and the y-axis. It doesn't say take a look at the top left. That's not top left. That's only top left if it's not centered. So we have to check for that. Well, you can, but we just did that. That's why I did all that work with the is centered stuff, right? So I'm going to say this. If we have to do it twice, one for object 1 and one for object 2, could be, each one of them could be centered or not centered, right? So if object 1 dot is centered, if it's true, if it's centered, then I got to do something, right? If it's centered. And if object 2 is centered, if object 2 is centered, then I also got to do something else, right? Those two things got to happen. If one of those things happen, then I want to set my offset a little differently. That means I need some kind of offset, right? Let's say let object 1 offset, right? And that offset is going to be for X and Y. That's what it's going to be. And I'm going to say this. It's going to be a new objects dot vector2 object, right? I'm going to start off at 0, 0. I'm going to do the same thing from object 2 offset. I'm going to say that that's a new objects dot vector2. So by default, there's no offset. That's what this is saying. No offset. However, if it's centered, then guess what I'm doing with this object dot offset? I'm going to say that objects 1 dot offset, right? Well, that's going to equal to a new objects vector 2, and it's going to be negative height and negative width, right? Well, I could certainly do this kind of stuff, right? I could certainly do this, and it would take me all these lines, and plus those lines. That's mouse. That's no good, right? Can we not do it in one line? And we can, using the ternary operator. So let's keep this little check in mind. So I'm going to say that if this is true, then I want to assign this, right? Else, assign this, right? Where my vector 2 is going to be to the left, half width, that's my offset, right? And half height, object 1 dot half width, right, on the x-axis. I know it's long, I'm sorry. And object 1 dot half height. So it's either going to be 0 if object is centered. If object is centered, I don't want it to be 0. I want if object is not centered, if it's not centered, then give it 0. Otherwise, give it this. And why? Because my default is not centered. Not centered. It's not centered, it's not centered, right? So I want to do the same thing with this one. So I'm going to say this, not centered, and we're going to say the question mark. Remember, this is the ternary operator. The question mark means if it's true, right? If it's true, then do this. Assign this to this. If it's false, right, then assign this to this, right, which is going to be just object 2 dot half width and object 2 dot half height. Oops. Okay, so I need those two things. Those things, this guard checks to see if the object is centered. I don't have to do all these lines. That's crazy. It smells. Okay, now this. Right? Well, what I want to do is, if object 1 is centered, I want to subtract object 1 position, right? I want to subtract it from object 2. So I could just say this. I could say that object 1 dot position, right, on the x minus object 1 offsets dot x, right? If it's 0, if it's not centered, it's going to just subtract 0, which is nothing. It's going to be not centered, right? But if it's centered, it's going to subtract half the width, right? And the same thing goes with half the height. Minus object 1 offsets dot y, right? And then I'm going to do the same thing from my object 2. So I'm just going to copy this and just change it to object 2 because I'm lazy. Sorry. Hopefully I won't forget. So this is object 2. Okay? Make sense? All right. Okay, and it says, I'm missing some stuff here, right? Object 2 dot position dot y minus object 2 dot half height. What the heck is that? Do I need that anymore? This part? Probably not, right? Whatever that was is not needed anymore. Okay, so now I've done this part. I've got my offset, top left and top right, or top left. And then I'm just going to go in here and say object 1 top left x is less than object 2 top left x plus object 2 width, right? It's going to do that calculation for me. And then I'm going to say that, well, if that's the case, if object 2 is not colliding, then collide, and then make sure it's colliding. And then else, which is going to go here, else, I want to do the same thing that I have here with the else, which is, well, now object 2 is colliding, right? Because this is this part, and I want to do this part. That's else, right? Make sense? And then let's turn this into a Boolean like my friend here suggested, right? Let's go Boolean, which means if it's colliding, then I want to return true. Otherwise, way down here, I'm going to return false. Like way down here. And did I do it in the wrong place? I did. It should go inside the bracket. Inside the curly brace, right here. Okay? That's 2 checks. I'm doing AABB and squared radius check. And that's part of your collision manager. Now I can do it for any 2 objects. Both those 2 checks. By the way, these 2 checks only handle 2 cases. Circle, circle, square, square. What about if I have circle, square? Like, well, I'm saying that could be possible, right? I have a ball and a paddle. Well, boom, like Pong, right? That's a different use case than square, square, right? Circle is different than a square, and you're going to have some really weird visual non-collisions that look like they're colliding because of the logic that you're putting in place, right? So it might look weird. I'm not going to give you that right now. It's no necessary. For our little case right now, for our first playable, it's not necessary. But there are many, many other collision detection algorithms. For example, line and circle check, line and square check, line check, right? Circle line check, or circle, and the other way. And by the way, it's not order matters. Circle AABB check, AABB circle check. Depending on the shape of the objects, we should be able to check any shape. Some kind of polygon, any polygon, polygon check, right? And by the way, AABB is axis aligned bounding box, right? It's aligned. You have alignment. Here's one axis and here's the other axis. And for this one, here's this axis and here's this axis, right? It's axis aligned. But what happens when you have a shape like this, right? And I want to collide with this shape. So this one is going to collide over here. This is not the same axis. This axis is over here and over here, let's say, right? That doesn't work. This is object aligned bounding box. If I want to make this an axis aligned bounding box, I have to draw another bounding box, a bounding volume that looks like this, right? To represent it. That means I'm going to have some space in here if I don't do it, right? And some space over here and some space over here, which is dead space. Remember, if I rotate an object, it's going to have to be represented somehow with this bounding volume. Okay? So that's no good. So, hey, by the way, guys, don't rotate. Because if you rotate, then your collision detection, out the window. Right? Because this assumes, AABB assumes everything is lined up nice. Right? In this case, if we want to do object-aligned bounding boxes, we have to think about another collision detection type where we take care of these vertices. When we rotate these vertices, we want to care between these vertices. And what we can do is we can project the vertices down onto my axis like this, right? So I have the axis now, and I can project these vertices onto the axis, right? Like this. And if I have another object like this one, okay, up here, let me draw this again so you understand what I'm talking about. And I know there's some theory here, I do apologize, but I want you to understand how difficult collision detection can be. It depends, right? We think about it simply because we just looked up an algorithm and we're laughing. Oh, that's easy, right? But actually, it can be not easy, right? So let's put these things here and I'll rotate them, right? So this is cool, but what if it's not like this, it's like this, right? And let's just draw the next one. So here's the next one, and I'll put it like over here. Okay, and let's just rotate this one too, right? So we'll get this one here and we'll rotate it. So let's just rotate this one and we'll position it something like this. Okay. Okay, we see a collision, yeah? See a collision. How do you detect the collision? There's no axis that's common, right? Our axes are all different, but we do have axes, right? If you think about this, we have 2 axes. We have the x-axis, right? And we have the y-axis over here, let's say, right? By the way, these, don't forget, my lines are not perfectly aligned. So what I can do is I can take this point and project it onto the y-axis, every point. Right? So I can project every vertex on the y-axis like this. Right? So I can put this on the y-axis. And the same thing goes with these ones. Okay? And then these ones too. So, do we have intersection between this from here to here and from here to here? The answer is yes. That's how you sit. You have to make all these checks. Do you have an intersection on the y-axis? Is between this point and this point, we have an intersection because those 2 points lie together. They're inside the same area. How about over here on the x-axis? Here and here? No. We have no collision here. How about between here and here? Yes. So now we have collisions in both axes, which is what the requirement is. If the requirement is to have collision on both sides, on this side, right? We have to have a collision on this side over here somewhere, and we have to have a collision somewhere over here on this axis. If we have collision on both sides, then you have a collision. Now, that is more complicated to calculate because you have to do vector projections onto a plane, right? Than the way we're doing it right now. And that only takes care of some of the cases, not all of the cases. For example, what if you have a concave object, right? And let me just talk about this concave object stuff. I have an object that doesn't look like this anymore. The object looks like, I don't know, something weird, like maybe like this. Right? So I have this kind of object. And then I have another object that goes inside like this. Does that collide? But, you know, if I use that other collision detection, it's colliding.
But using rectangles will be the same.
Yeah.
The same error can occur.
Yeah. That's why.
In that position, if you project the lines, looks like they are colliding.
That's right. That's right. And that's the problem because we have a concave objects. Concave objects, you have to do other math for this. Right? There's mesh. You have to use a mesh to kind of decide whether it's colliding or not. And so I'm saying what we're doing right now is very simple collision detection. We're not doing more complex collision detection that can detect collision between any objects. No. That's more math. That's another set of collision detection. What would be nice to have is we don't do is this colliding with this? We just say check collision, and then it finds the collision shape and compares the shapes and knows what to do. That's the right thing to do. We don't have that right now, and that would take a couple of sessions together to do. Lots of code. So I'm just pointing this out so you know that this system that we're making is a little bit flawed. It's got some problems. We need to know that because I don't want you to think Tom showed us this collision detection, somehow it doesn't work. Depends is the answer. Depends on what you put in it. So for your game, make it round, make it square. Don't make it round and square, okay? Or don't make it concave like this. You make something concave, that's another kind of collision detection we haven't covered. Okay? Make sense? Let's get back. So, yeah, we have these collision detection methods. Now, let's check it, right? I have this. I want to use it here in my update in my game. And just like I did before, I want to use AABB Check first. So I want to say that, hey, collision, right? We have our managers. Managers.collision.AABB Check. This is how it looks now. And I take object 1 and object 2. So that's like the player and the start button, right? And now we know if there's a collision, right, between the player and the start button. But we're not done because even though we added the collision class, it's not added to my folder until I add it to my index.html. You need to do this because our index.html is the manifest that binds everything together, right? And managers need to know about vector. We need to know about vectors. We need to know about game objects. So they cannot come above game object. They must come here, right? Something like this. Script, source, and then /managers. Sorry, scripts, managers, and then collision. This one. Okay, so now it's in. And now when we run our code, back to this, right? what we want to see is in the console, a collision only happened once. Look how beautiful that is now. So if I come here, right, you can see how nice and sensitive that is. Right here, on this side, no problem. Here, right, and so on. That's good. That's much better than before. Better than a circle. Circle and this, they're not circles. It's circle and a square. We don't have that collision detection yet. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to give you circle and square, right? You need that, right? But for now, there's none. You only have circle, circle, square, square. That's it. Okay, just letting you know. Okay, questions around collision detection and collision manager. Okay, good. I'm going to save this up online. So let's put it up on GitHub. So again, let's go to our code. And we see that there's a bunch of changes. These are all the changes. I'm going to add these to the staging area here, all of them. Let's add them on again. There we go. I'm going to say added collision manager, because that's what we did. And we made some other minor changes, but this is enough. Okay, and then push. We're going to push this up on GitHub. And now that we did that, we can see on GitHub, here's our GitHub. Where do we put it? If I refresh, we're going to see another thing today, right? Collision manager. If I go to my code, you can see everything here. This is all my collision managers here. You can see that latest commit affected my package.json. It also affected my scripts. And which script it affected? Game and objects. You can see that it affected button and game object, as well as player. Those are the places where I made my changes. So lots and lots of changes. Because remember, I added is centered. I needed to find that out because I can't center my box unless I know that I'm centered. And I couldn't do my centering until I waited for my thing to load. Right? Lots of stuff. Any questions around this stuff right now? I think I want to stop recording here to have one succinct recording on how to do collisions. And then I'm going to start the recording again and talk about state machine, which is the next thing I want to talk about. So let's stop recording now. Let's take 10 minutes, all right? And when we come back, we'll start state machine, okay?